My own journey into the kink world was overseen by a close confidant. Danny, who has years of experience navigating different types of relationships, witnessed and supported my journey to understanding polyamory. With his background in psychology, he gave me the concepts and tools required to explore something I had always felt within me. In this episode, we discuss not only my journey, but monogamy, female desire, and how ethical plays into all of this. Hi, welcome back to the life of Tash Mia. I'm Tash, and today I've got a very special guest, someone that's known me for
a long time.
A very long time, very long time. Back in my very I'll still kink, but definitely my more vanilla stage of my life. And today we're here to talk about desire, primarily female desire, societal, environmental impacts, and where we are with this. And I just want to welcome Danny and say thank you for being part of this episode today.
Hi, Tash.
I'm really excited. We have some really interesting conversations and wanted to kind of bring that to the audience.
Oh, that's one of the things. We've always had really interesting conversations.
Just never got to record them. So just to give the audience a bit of a feel of like what's your background and where you've come from and your experience.
Yeah, so I guess I think the phrase is heteronormative.
Yeah.
So I'm about as white slice vanilla as you get. And I first met you way back when we were co-workers in the same office. And I'm not into kink. I did hear your first series though. It was quite interesting. So yeah, I'm not really into kink at all. And I'm independent, which is a better way of saying single.
Yeah.
So, but I do identify myself as polyamorous.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and that's a really difficult distinction to make because it's not always about lots of playing in parties and romping around everywhere. It's also about how I position myself, and it's almost politically. So I'm more, I guess, aligned politically to the idea of polyamory, and that's things that we're gonna cover.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about polyamory probably a bit more in our second episode, but we will touch about it on this episode too. And for the people out there probably who have no idea what polyamory is, how would you best describe it?
It's a really good question. Actually, I'll tell the story when I first introduced you to it because I'd only heard about it a few years prior to this. And in the office, we were, I think, just chewing the fat. I think you were talking with someone else behind me and I was overhearing the conversation. So I was eavesdropping. And you were having a problem with, well, is this it? I'm in a relationship and is that it? So it's like just one penis for the rest of my life?
Yeah.
Is that where I'm going?
Yeah.
And I was listening to what you were saying and I turned around and I said, oh, so you're poly. And you had no idea what I was talking about. It was just funny to see your reaction. Poly,
yeah.
And your eyes lit up. And it was like, what's polyamory? And so it's like, what's that? And so we, and it was difficult at first because there is a boundary at work that you dare not cross lest the HR department find out. So we delved into it slowly over a couple of months, and we had quite a lot of sitting around and having coffee. We called it coffee, but we drank chai, which was interesting. But slowly I got to see where you were from and how disaffected you were. Just like you were not really into the life that you were in. It was the epitome of, white slice vanilla.
Yeah,
normative.
and I think because I kind of started my kink journey in my early 20s, and like I've always said, my biggest kink is like group stuff, and even that start of that relationship where what I was talking to you about had started in that kink environment. It was kind of like, oh, okay, like we've done this for a while, but now this is serious. Now like we have a child, so therefore it ended. Yeah. And I was kind of struggling around with the fact that why does that correlate? Why does the fact that I can't continue this lifestyle?
I can't continue to have fun.
Yeah. But I think the biggest lesson I learned, and like you obviously saw me post that big relationship, which was a very long-term relationship breakup, I then endeavored on this massive journey that's kind of taken to me where I am now. But there was lots of reiterations of like what works, what doesn't work.
Yeah, there was a lot of experiment. There was a lot of finding out and exploring.
Yeah.
And working out issues with potential partners that like the recurring patterns that kept on popping up. It was an interesting journey. I was quite privileged to be party to it, to be able to witness it through those conversations.
And just to give also audiences a bit of a background on, you no longer work in the arena, but you're originally a trained therapist.
Oh yes, so I very importantly, I've got a 3 years training as a psychotherapist. I've also got a degree in psychology, but I'm not researcher.
Yeah.
I'm not doing any research, and I'm not actively using the psychotherapy background.
And I think it's really interesting because you've talked to me about this in the past. What were your kind of reasons for like stepping out of that arena?
Primarily, it was to do with, I felt that my own issues were not addressed properly.
Yeah.
And that unless I was working with men specifically in men's issues, which I could still happily do, I just felt that I was probably more dangerous than anything else. And so I didn't want to confuse my own development with what needed to happen for the client or the patient in the room. And so I stepped away more from an ethical perspective than anything else. I had a long history of interactions with women who had come out of quite significant trauma. And so, and I had a lot of, I guess, secondary trauma, having witnessed that was really unaddressed in my own life. And I felt it safer to steer clear of that for the time being. And also being a programmer and IT makes a lot of money. So that's my day job.
The basic truth. So I want to get into kind of what I really wanted to talk about this first episode, which is really around like female desire and kind of, societal environmental impacts around that. I think a really good starting point is when me and you started to have these like lunchtime coffee, very long conversations that we probably should have recorded back then.
Very interesting conversation.
You had disclosed, obviously was always very open about my lifestyle, even when I wasn't working in kink. Even prior to that, it was something I was always willing to talk to people about. And you told the story of what we were talking about to a friend and my journeys and what I was doing. And what was her response?
Oh, sorry. You'll have to refresh my memory on this one.
She was talking about what type of lifestyle I was living. She was saying I was living a very
promiscuous lifestyle.
Hedonistic was the word.
Oh.
Hedonistic was the word.
Oh, now I remember.
Yeah, and she was just absolutely like appalled by the way.
Yeah, I this is the thing. Over time, I disclosed less and less about the interesting conversations that I was having. Whilst your honesty is unfailing in when you're sitting with me, I felt that I had to not disclose that more and more as you went further and further along the path. Yeah. But when I had disclosed it earlier on, a lot of people had, it was really interesting. They would lambaste you. They would criticize you as being not of sound mind, of being a person who was too promiscuous, who was too, hedonistic was the word that came up. I remember this colleague at work, and she got quite angry with me for even wanting to interact with you.
Yeah.
Even though I'm quite white slice vanilla, she felt that I had, I was confusing my own boundaries.
Where do you think this comes from in people when they have those type of reactions?
That's a
big question.
That's a huge question because this particular person in mind was extremely conservative in her own sexuality and identity. And it was like she'd never really taken the time to talk about what would be her pleasure, what would be her desire. That wasn't even a factor. And so no one should talk about it.
Yeah.
And the very fact that it's out there and that it's obvious, and I can understand where she was coming from in this. It's like, maybe I should talk about it from my own perspective as well, because I can understand it from hers. We get kind of bombarded with desire 24/7. It's just all the time there. It's in every song, every movie, every ad. It's like sex, desire.
Yeah.
You can have anything you want. And I even give it a term, the youth and beauty industrial complex. It's this massive rolling beast of trying to provoke you into wanting something. And I think for her, there was just this incredibly strong boundary to say, no, that's not right, and we need to be proper and ethical, and yes, occasionally you have sex, but it's sort of lie back and think of England type sex. so but the point is that there's no conversation about it. And she would not be willing to enter into a conversation about her own desire and sexuality. For many, many years, I thought that was normal. And because of the history that I had with women who'd suffered trauma, I'd also come to the thinking that women didn't actually have the same level of desire and the same level of wanting to have pleasure. And that was until I met you.
Yeah.
So you kind of took those assumptions and misconceptions and threw them out the window. And they very much challenged where I was looking at female sexuality and thinking it didn't exist. And I think that's part of the myth.
Yeah.
That's part of the story that society wants to tell itself in order to keep things manageable.
And, the typical saying is that, men have the high libido and women don't, and women lose desire in their relationships to have sex. But, if we dig deeper as to what is the reason, and I think that's where we get onto a whole interesting new conversation about,
How much time do we have?
All the time in the world. About, why are women losing so-called desire in these long-term relationships? And, sexual researchers are actually saying that it's women who struggle with monogamy more than men.
Yeah.
And
this was an eye-opener from the book that you gave it to me.
So one of my favorite books is called Untrue by Wednesday Martin. She goes through a lot of research by a lot of sexual and anthropologists about what they found. They look at even, one of my favorite studies from them is, looking at bonobos and primates, which bonobos are our closest genetic match. And they live in a matriarchal polyamorous society.
Yeah.
So,
and there's actually biologically, I mean, my other degree was in biology, and there's actually a lot of evidence around things like testes size, for instance, is a really good indicator.
Yeah.
And she brings up this research and looks at it. So gorillas, for instance, have they have a very patriarchal, hierarchical society, and there's an alpha gorilla, not very friendly to be in gorilla society.
Yeah.
But there's an inverse correlation between their testes size and the bonobos, which have an open and so basically larger testes.
Yeah.
But it's for the production of sperm, and it's just how that's evolved. So yes, I looked into some of the research that she'd done, so I followed through on the references.
Yeah.
It's all credible. Some of that is quite well peer reviewed, and I'd recommend it as a primary source for information.
And I think it's really interesting, that they talk about, how even they mate, and looking at especially the females. Yeah.
So for instance, in the bonobo society, there's this sex is actually used as a way of calming down tensions.
Yeah.
In a gorilla society, it's just as much aggro as the alpha male wants to perpetrate, they will perpetrate.
Yeah.
So the contrast is there to see just inside the primate family.
Yeah.
You can see that.
Also, bonobos spend a lot of their days having sex
and enjoying
apparently.
themselves.
And a lot of the times they say it's initiated by the females a lot of the time, and it can actually be in quite of an aggressive manner. It's like, I want you, come now, and it will be with multiple partners. They've also even argued in some species the reason why women are, women can multiple orgasm. Men kind of like shoot their load, and generally that's kind of it. Why?
Unless they're in a play party, from what I hear. Yeah.
Unless they're in one of my play parties. But women do have the ability to multiple orgasm.
Yeah, this is
more
another.
So than men, and the reason why is there is a biological link to that reason.
Yeah, so a woman will become more receptive in terms of her own pleasure.
Yeah.
It takes 15 minutes, 20 minutes to build up.
Yeah.
Okay, by that time, that's 3 or 4 men.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is this idea of multiple partners actually being relevant. Something that wasn't mentioned in the book was even the different types of sperm.
Yeah.
So you got blocking sperm and running sperm, and so there's different types of sperm that get produced depending upon whether the male knows if there's other men involved in reproduction.
And
with the
also
female.
they said even the shape of the penis
Yep.
is to clear out the semen of the prior partner, which is, we're getting very graphic here.
All this stuff that goes on that we don't know about. You need proper cameras for this sort of research.
But I think, I just use that as an example of looking at a species that we're closely related to. And obviously, there's female desire is clearly seen in other parts of the nature, but we go back to the human race.
To read Wednesday Martin, for instance, just as one source, what it does is it calls into question all of the assumptions that we've made around relationship or connection or how we reproduce.
Yeah.
So there's so many misconceptions that are just fundamentally thrust up and go, no, seriously?
Yeah. And I think a great example of that is that women for so long have been told what is normal.
That's right.
Especially when it comes to sex.
Yep.
And, the assumption of monogamy.
Yes.
And of our libidos and our desire. And we're just now finding out, well, not just finding it out, but we're starting more and more to be realizing
having
that
the conversation about it.
Women do have desire, and often it's a lot higher than men. I talk with my girlfriends all the time, and our libidos are often higher than our partners.
Yep. A big misconception.
And I think the second really big misconception that plays into female desire is, the reason why women cheat. Now, we call the, infidelity gap is closing.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting more parable to men, like the instances of women cheating, which I think is interesting because I think maybe it's not reported as high. Like, you do a survey, not everyone's going to be honest.
So we need the data on this.
You're not going to be honest.
We need the longitudinal data.
There is this infidelity gap closing, and the research has been done that many women are in these committed and self-reported happy marriages, but they're not sexually satisfied, or they're in a sexless relationship, or they're not getting sex as much as they want, and they're going outside of that relationship. And I'm not talking about open relationships here yet. I'm just talking about the general assumed monogamous relationship.
This is something that sorry.
Yeah, no, go on.
Something that came up just as a way of putting it into a framework. If you imagine there's a continuum, and we're all somewhere along this continuum.
Yeah.
At one end of the continuum is exclusive monogamous and loyal all their life. So that's one end of the continuum. And then you move along and you've got cheating, which is behavior where you want to pretend that it's monogamous, but it's not.
Yeah.
And you're not being honest with yourself, you're not being honest with your partner. And then you move along further and you've got sort of like relationships, particularly when they're early.
Yeah.
They're kind of open, but undiscussed. Unspoken open.
Yeah.
And then you have like open, which is spoken open.
Like ethical non-monogamy.
Well, then you move on to the polyamory and the ethical. And it's interesting when I say to people, I identify myself as ethical non-monogamous. They go, "Oh, Non-monogamous, what does that mean? I'm going, you missed the first word.
Yeah, ethical. Yeah. But it's funny and it's very true. But, you know, as I was saying, these females who are happy, self-reported happy in these marriages are stepping out.
Yes.
And they are stepping out purely for sexual gratification.
Yep.
The misconception is if a woman steps out, it's always emotional. And to be honest, I actually think it's probably
men
reverse,
Yep.
to be honest, because it is reported that men in long-term relationships, if they're getting enough, and whatever enough means to that particular person obviously is a variable, if they're getting enough sex in that long-term relationship, generally they're fine. Women,
if they're
aren't.
not, yeah,
they're still struggling with it.
Yeah.
They're still struggling with it. And it comes down to the fact, I think, that, you know, women have much larger of a diverse, if you know what I mean, sexual range,
Yep.
sexual appetite. And they did studies where they hooked men and women up to machines that will monitor their reactions to images and videos. And women got a lot more aroused by a lot more different things, even if it was outside of their sexual orientation. So she might have identified as a heterosexual monogamous female, but if she was shown images of, you know, heterosex, woman on woman sex, man on man sex, or like even things she might not be into, group sex, whatever it was, she would get more aroused than she would get aroused. If a man came in who identified as a straight heterosexual male, he generally would respond to things that are within his sexual orientation.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's an anecdote for that, how it plays out with strippers.
Yeah.
So male strippers, when you have a female stripping for a male, the audience is, you know, they're just deadpan. Now, do an imitation of a female audience when there's a male stripper.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's crazy, woohoo, you
That's
know.
So true.
So it just as an anecdote,
yeah,
it tells the story about how when you actually dig down, we're just completely missing what's happening with female sexuality and desire.
And I think it's interesting to note, you know, if we look at the history of where this has come from, which, you know, is a long history. I mean, we look at where we are now, but you've got to think about, like, this is only the last 30 years, 40 years max,
the last
that
fraction
really
of time.
women are coming out in their own and being a little bit more empowered in their sexual desire. I think, you know, as women get more financial freedom and independence, that's only going to keep growing.
So this is a really key point that I guess it inspired me early on when we discussed it and we talked about it, and you were fairly financially independent, and I've got this. Well, we believe that the financial independence, the financial critical. Emancipation has to precede the sexual emancipation.
Yeah.
So, you know, equal pay for women and all of that, absolutely. Yeah. But it's more about when you know that you don't need a man for raising a child, that gives you the freedom to find the man that you want the partner that you want.
And make choices that you want.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we look at how women, you know, prior to having more financial freedom, they were in marriages. You know, if you think back just to, like, you know, a good example is, like, you think of, like, the 40s and 50s, like, you know, when our the relationships that our parents would have witnessed of their parents, where women a lot of the time would have stay-at-home caretakers. You know, whether they worked before the marriage, maybe sometimes. Very few remained in it, but once they had children, they were at home, which means you're out of the workforce. And then the risk to step out on that marriage because you're sexually unsatisfied is huge.
It's a financial risk.
Because then if the risk was often seen as it was too high. It doesn't mean that women didn't have the desire. People think, like, oh, well, like, all of a sudden women are like these sexual creatures, there's all this desire. It's like,
no, it's always been there. It was
always there, but the risk for women was too high because what they get divorced, they're going to be societally shamed for it.
Yep.
Especially if you stepped out and had an affair. You know, I said to you, you don't want to be that woman at the school, you know, line picking up their kid. That woman.
I witnessed that firsthand growing up. I'm the child of a widowed mother, and we were shunned by the rest of the community. And yet that was a widow.
Yeah.
Imagine if it was a divorce.
Yeah.
Or some sort of other. So it all changed back in the 50s when the war was on, the Second World War. We just had to have women in factories.
Yeah.
That was required if we were going to, succeed. And then after the soldiers came home, I was like, okay, now you can go back to your home.
Yeah.
And no, I like having a wage.
Yeah.
I like having my own salary and independence, and I'm going to keep doing that.
Yeah.
Which is exactly, I think that was the tipping point in our society where it opened up all these possibilities, like, yes, social, financial, and other possibilities for women, but it also opened up the possibility around sexuality and desire and women going for what they wanted, rather than continuing to live in basically a worldview that had been constructed through patriarchy.
Yeah.
So interestingly, patriarchy itself, I see monogamy as the end game of patriarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a contentious thing to say, because most people like their monogamous relationship, and that's fine. And when women have the choice to do more than what is in a monogamous situation, then monogamy itself needs to change. And it's like the very last domino to fall in patriarchy will be monogamy.
Yeah.
And how we have so many constructs and the stories that we tell ourselves around patriarchy. They're all in the process of changing. One of the things that you pointed out some time ago is that for the polyamorous, for adults who want to do adult play, that world is where the LGBTQI was about 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
So we're in a transition phase, and it's easy to look at it from the outside and go, oh, society's morals are being corrupted, and I can understand that argument.
Yeah.
And by the same token, it's like, well, we need to have a discussion. What's wrong with having a discussion around it?
Yeah.
What's wrong with talking about it? Why can't you talk about your desires? Why can't you talk about your, what you want in terms of a pleasurable relationship connection with another person?
Yeah, because people enter into long-term monogamous / marriages, and they haven't even had the discussion.
No.
It's an assumption.
That's right.
So you're born with this assumption of that you enter a relationship and it's monogamous. No one's actually ever talked to you about this different ways until hopefully more now. But, I give the story now, I have a 6-year-old daughter, and she's come, she is someone, she's someone, she's a person. She's exposed, luckily, I like this fact, to many different lifestyles, just purely because of, my social circle and my family members. I was born into a family where my auntie was already married to another woman, still is to this day.
Yeah.
So I was born into a family where different types of sexuality and orientations was a norm. But really at that time, it wasn't fully accepted in society yet. I just happened to fall upon a family where it was. And now also my sister is engaged to a female. One of my closest friends is a homosexual male. So she knows like his partners who are men. But still, with my daughter having that foundational and background context, has come home to school and says to me, when you get married, Mummy, making the assumption that I would ever get married, whether it happens or not is different. It surely would be a very different type of marriage, that's for sure. Then I'll get a brother or sister.
Right.
So my 6-year-old has already made a correlation at 6, even though I obviously at home is not feeding this information because I don't live this lifestyle, that marriage equals a baby. And I'm like, and also she knows that me and her dad were never married. So, I'm like, well, me and daddy had you, we weren't married.
Yeah, so
and I'm like, why is she still being fed? It's obviously coming from somewhere, which I assume is school, assume it's her friends who probably, the majority live with mum and dad in the white picket fence house.
Yeah. So I have to play devil's advocate here because a lot of people, would ask me, how can she do this to her daughter? So by do this, live the lifestyle that you lead.
Yes, which is one
So
thing I
that's
got
a
a lot of
common
backlash
question.
about, and women do. As soon as you become a mother, it's like, oh, you're expected not to have any more sexual desire.
Yeah.
Or
So
want to play.
I remember one of your responses to that question when I heard it, which was like, why are you associating sexuality with children?
Yeah.
And it's right back in your face. It's like it's got nothing to do with raising a child.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting way that you spoke to it. But, speaking to it, how can you live this lifestyle when you have a daughter? I'll ask the question.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question because obviously I think it's age appropriateness. My daughter doesn't, I don't talk to my daughter about, oh, hey, I'm running a play party this Saturday night, which I actually am.
It's irrelevant.
She's 6 years old. I'm not going to have that discussion with her yet. I don't hide different types of sexual orientations from my daughter because I do think that's age appropriate, that there's, homosexuality, lesbians or people who are non-binary or like trans, or I don't hide that. I think that is age appropriate because that is the world we're living in and hopefully are going to continue even to live in more and more. But it's funny because she asked me the other day, I'm getting all the big questions. She comes to my house on a Wednesday after school. And the last few weeks, I'm just getting hit with all the big questions. First one was, why do we die? And I'm like, well, I haven't even worked out that one yet. So, but the last week's one was, where are babies? Like, how are babies made? And I was like, oh my God. So I was trying to like explain it to her, but I was obviously doing a very bad job because you could just see it in her face. She was like, ugh.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, oh, I'm going to get that book. Do you remember that book called Where Do I Come From?
Yeah.
When was it written? 60s or 70s? It's very old, but I'm like, I'll get that book because my parents had it. And at least I remembered it had a very good explanation of basically like egg and sperm and the fertilization and the pregnancy and that bit, which is kind of what I was struggling to like.
So this is.
And like how like with the male genitalia and female genitalia. But the funniest thing, I started reading the book and I'm like, oh my God, this is so heterosexual normative.
Of course it is. It's part of the myth making.
And I was like, why haven't they updated this book? So I was ad-libbing to the book. So it was saying like, there's mummy and daddy and, daddy has different body parts. You would have noticed to mummy. He has a, a penis and mummy has a vagina. And when they love each other, they start to cuddle and then, they will get excited. So daddy gets on top of mummy. And I'm like, all other positions. It was still like they had a picture of a woman on her back and the man on top. And I'm like, I'm not teaching my daughter to be a starfish.
Right.
And then I also had to keep, and because it kept referring to like the man and the woman making the baby. So then I was ad-libbing, or a woman and a woman, or a man and a man, or like a non-binary person with someone else. I said there's many people who make babies together, and it's not just that the penis goes into the vagina. You can also like do like IVF, and my daughter's brain was just like, what? Like, but I'm like, I'm not reading her a book. I know she's 6, but I'm not reading a book that is going to teach my daughter a baby happens only through a man and a woman having sex with him on top.
Yeah.
With the blanket over.
So, I mean, look, the biologist in me says that there is something fundamentally normal in a man and a woman conceiving a child, but that's not the end of the story. It's not even the beginning of the story.
Yeah.
From me, if you look at so I look at it also from a neurological point of view, where the human brain, we're born very, very small and quite immature, and that brain, which is so essential for our survival, takes a long time to grow. It takes 12, 14 years for it to get to a point where it can look after itself.
Yeah.
And through that time, there's key points in the development of a child where there's massive reorganization at a neuronal level. Mm-hmm. One of the key ones that happens is adolescence. And this is something that doesn't get talked about much, but what happens at adolescence, and your daughter's not there yet. Yeah. So that's the age appropriateness. Yeah. But there will come a point in time when she will cease to be an organism. Like, we're organisms that We avoid pain and we seek pleasure.
Yeah.
Now, before adolescence, that's pleasure seeking is an individual thing. But after adolescence, we encompass the connection that we can have with another person. And that's a fundamental neurological change that happens in the brain. So, and we just know it as adolescence.
Yeah.
For instance, the other thing that happens is that men lose the ability to speak. I mean, it literally affects their temporal lobe. And you've heard a teenage boy trying to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Did you go have a nice day at school? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but it's all these changes that happen. But you turn from an individual pleasure seeker to a connection pleasure seeker.
Yeah.
Now, you'll have a completely different set of conversations with your daughter.
Yeah.
When she becomes of age.
Yeah.
And then you can start to bring in all of the other complex fundamental things that are adjunct to relationship.
Yeah. And also the conversations, coming back to desire, which is not generally a conversation that's had.
No.
With kids or adolescent children or really at any stage.
But it's like that gets concreted in. And like this woman that was, was against you.
Yeah.
That idea of not talking about desire gets cemented in at adolescence, and we reach 20s and 30s.
Especially to women. Especially
for
to women. And that's why it leads on to women feeling they're not normal.
And then the other not normal thing, the other issue around this, or not issue, the other factor in this is the prevalence of porn that's come out with the internet. I mean, so much has already been said on that, but that is also perpetuating wrong concepts around female sexuality and desire.
Yeah.
And that's not being addressed either.
Yeah.
So there are some people addressing it. I think who's that woman in England? The what's that website?
Killing Kittens?
No.
Oh.
Make love not sex.
Make love not porn.
That's it. Make love not porn.
Sydney Gallop.
Yeah. So there's some very progressive stuff going on in that area. But these are small voices in a flood, a torrent of what is essentially male-driven perceptions around.
And also she's very much, if you listen to her talks or what her business goal is really to show adolescents especially what sex really is.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And she's often had parents and school teachers reach out and ask, how should I address this? Because my child has got access to the internet and this is what they're being raised on.
Yeah. Yeah. So, do you have that conversation? Yes.
Yes.
And do you need the materials to have that? How can you have the conversation with a teenager about sex and desire? And let's face it, it's actually about connection.
But they do
that's
have
where
it.
we
Like
really
you
want
look at
them to know.
Scandinavian countries who are much more open about sex, and those conversations were being had. I remember reading the case study about a Scandinavian girl who was brought to live in the US, and she was just so shocked about they're getting to that older adolescent stage where they were starting to have sex and stuff, but her friends were so uneducated around it compared to her. Because it was much more talked about in their society.
Yeah.
So I do think, there are places where the conversations are being said, much more progressive societies than, I was talking about the US then, but especially even in Australia, we don't talk about it.
So this was one of the thoughts that occurred to me leading into this, which was around these misconceptions, because we don't know how to talk consent, we don't talk at all.
Yeah.
And so one of the problems is when someone like you presents, or someone like you, when I am confronted with a woman that has very strong views around sex and sexuality and is completely transparent and open around it, that challenges me. Mm-hmm. And so just because you're talking about sex and sexuality does not mean you want to have sex.
Yeah.
Does not mean you want to have sex with someone.
Yeah.
It's just that it's a conversation.
Yeah.
And
so we're not used to having it.
And because we don't have the conversation, that conversation can be arousing.
Yeah.
But that's not consent.
No.
And so it's really important to have, we kind of need to have practice in having a conversation, but separate that from arousal.
Yeah.
Because the arousal can only really happen when there's consent.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, I don't know, what are your thoughts on how consent plays into the dialogue that we need to have around desire and sexuality?
I mean, obviously, because of my, kink and my profession in BDSM, consent is a huge part of my life. Like, there's no play without consent. And yeah, I think it's as desire's not spoken about. I've said this before, consent is still not spoken about a lot.
Yeah.
And how to get that consent and what consent is. I've always talked about, and especially in kink, consent is regarded as hell yes. Not just like, yeah. It's like, it's a hell, yeah, maybe. It's a hell yes. And then also it can be retracted at any time.
That's right. Yeah, just because you've met someone at a bar.
Yeah, and you said, this is something I want to try with you or something, it doesn't mean
that's right.
you can at the time just be like, actually, I'm not feeling it. And then that's consent revoked.
So,
do you know what I mean?
So one of the problems, and it goes to my background around, being independent.
Yeah.
And I speak to a lot of men out there who would identify as, what's that term? I think they call it involuntary celibate. I don't see myself incel. Yeah, I don't call myself involuntary celibate. But I can understand that point of view. I've identified that I actually have flirting dyslexia. That's the term that I use, which is
your personal terminology.
Which is there's this. I think there's a misconception that, like in a flirting situation, that everyone's going to understand the same signals of that flirting situation, but there's no data to support that.
Yeah.
Everyone's going to have a different take on what flirting is. Where are the what should be responded to, what is not flirting, what is, just being polite. And so if, like me, you've got flirting dyslexia, then it becomes a real problem because flirting is deliberately ambiguous. It's like we flirt because we don't want to take the risk of being overt. Mm-hmm. And so a woman learns how to flirt. Men also learn how to flirt as well, but a woman learns how to flirt as a way of hiding what she really wants in terms of sex and sexuality. Now, that's just been my experience.
Yeah.
But I think women are getting more overt, and women are getting more clear on what they want.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. They're talking about you remember that Ashley Madison website?
Oh yeah.
And they were saying like women who are going on there for extramarital affairs, as I said, their sexuality or their desire was not being met at home, but they were purely going onto this site they were finding. They knew exactly what they wanted. They were so explicit. Like, I want a X hung length cock, someone that can go for X amount of time. And they were very specific on what they wanted and what they wanted to do. They didn't want a relationship. And a lot of these women said, if I ever matched with someone and then they started getting feelings for me or something that wasn't along the scope of what I wanted, I would break it off.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
and then a lot of the time they got very negative backlash from the male person that they were involved with from this.
Yeah, so
which will kind of indicate to you that, as I said before, women aren't just stepping out because they're in unhappy relationships. And I think often men step out. I'm not saying all the time, and I don't have the research on this, and I'm sure there is probably more research around it. I think men are more likely to step out on a relationship because he's emotionally unmet, not necessarily by his partner, but he's emotionally unmet by himself.
Yeah, so there is.
And they, Esther Perel talks about, infidelity and things. And she said, we take it so personally when our partner cheats on us. We take it as there's something wrong with me, blah, 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 blah. But she explains it as it's not about the other person most of the time. It's often about the person who's doing the cheating has lost connection with themselves and they wanting to be maybe an old version of themselves or maybe a different version of themselves, and that's what they're getting from stepping out.
Yeah,
they are able to become this new or altered version of themselves. So it's really about them.
So one of I have to bring in, I do meditation, do retreats and everything else.
Yeah.
So and I get a lot from that in terms of a spiritual practice. So I'm going to throw in a curveball here. One of the things I heard on the weekend, which I remember, it's like often we think that we're physical beings having a spiritual experience.
Yeah.
But actually we're a spiritual being having a physical experience.
That's how I believe
So
it.
a part of that physical experience is having sex, but it's also the connection that comes with forming, like the connection that we have in forming relationships. Over, this after the 7-year itch is hit and people are getting bored in their relation, bored or there's no freshness.
For women, they say 1 to 2 years, and
1
then
to 2 years.
they're wanting like freshness and something
so
different.
What's happening is that we've found a connection.
Yeah.
We value that connection. Like the connection can be ongoing, but we still want more connection.
Yeah.
And so, and this is this is leading on to the polyamory.
Yeah.
And it's what's, all these talks with you has changed my whole position around monogamy.
Yeah.
Mostly because it's encouraged me to do inner work around my own, sex and sexuality.
Yeah.
So we don't think anything of having a partner and then that partnership ends and then you go off and you immediately get another partner. So we have no problem with serial monogamy.
So, which is something that Esther Perel explains. She says we all talk about we're monogamous, but actually we're just serial monogamous. We're not with one person goes through life. We're just like one person, next person, next person.
And I know people that, that gap in between relationships is all of microseconds.
Yeah.
It's like they instantly into another connected relationship.
Yeah.
So what's interesting around that is there is no the one.
Yeah.
I remember your initial protests way back when talking about what is this the one? You know? Surely there's 9 billion people in the world, there's more than one.
Yeah.
So we don't have a problem with the idea of having the one for now.
Yeah.
Until that one dries up and then we move on to another one.
Exactly.
And then another one.
Yeah.
So it raises the point, which is we're okay with serial monogamy or serial connection.
Yeah.
Why not parallel connection?
Yeah.
Now, all that monogamy is serial connection. Polyamory is parallel connection. So you might have a primary relationship and you feel a strong connection with him or her, and then you find that there is another person
that you also have a connection with.
You're developing a connection with.
And I think this is really probably a good place to end this episode, because I want to talk more about this in our next episode about polyamory and get into that, because that is something that we're both very passionate on, clearly. But
is there anything else from the misconceptions?
I think we're going to have to dive into that next time because we're running out of time today.
Okay.
But it's been really good to talk to you. I mean, sexuality is such a big topic, and I don't think we're there quite yet on it.
No.
And we've still got very far to go, but
yeah,
these conversations and raising awareness about it
thank you for continuing to challenge me. So.
More than welcome. Okay, thanks everyone, and we'll catch you next time on The Life of Tash Mia. And remember, stay kinky.